Tonight's speaker is Gareth Stace. Gareth is the Director General of UK Steel, which is part of EEF. So UK Steel is the trade association for the UK steel sector, and it represents the views of the UK manufacturing steel sector within not just Europe, so lobbying MPs, but within Europe as well. And UK Steel, I think it's fair to say, is central, actually, to all the debates in the UK in terms of steel strategy. And Gareth has in his team people that produce, well, I think, a pretty impressive fact sheets, research documents. And what's extra interesting, I think, about UK Steel is that it supports the industry through in the way I've just described, but also through collaboration with industry leaders, MPs, and very close association with trade union leaders. It's quite impressive, and it's kind of a real example of I would suggest, social partnership in action. So Gareth's been with UK Steel since 2007. He also chairs the UK Manufacturers Climate Change Group and BEIS, that's the Ministry's Green Economy Energy Intensive subgroup, and is recognised by me and most other people in the industry as an expert on the steel industry. I've known Gareth for a few years personally, and he and his team at UK Steel have been incredibly supportive of my own research, and hence through the Work and Employment Relations Division and its research centre, CERIC. So that's a very, very close, productive collaboration. So, as a final comment, it's probably well known amongst this audience, at least, that in 2016, the UK steel industry had an almost a near-death experience. There's been an element of stabilisation since, but the UK steel industry, along with the world steel industry, is still reorganising, is still restructuring, and the UK industry is still in, I would say, in intensive care. So what Gareth is going to talk about is, surprisingly, the steel industry, its historic development, current challenges, and possible future trajectory. So, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ian, and thank you very much. I feel very honoured that you invited me to do this talk quite a few months ago, actually, and I walked into the building and saw all the name tags and said, "Oh, hang on! I thought it would be about like 20 people or something in a smaller room." So I'm a bit bowled over and very impressed that you all taken the time out to come and hear what I've got to say this evening. So I hope it does it justice in terms of what I'm going to say. I tried to think about, if I've got half an hour, 45 minutes, what should I actually talk about? In terms of the title is The Future of the UK Steel Industry, and if I knew what the future was, then I probably wouldn't be here talking to you now. I'd be a very rich person in the Bahamas or something. So I will talk about what I think the future should be in terms of the steel industry, but what I really wanted to do was, at the beginning and throughout this lecture, this talk, is talk about the historical side of the steel industry and where we were, where we got to. Ian talked about the crisis, and I'll talk a lot about the crisis, and then I'll end with coming out of that crisis, and as I said, where we go next. Hopefully there'll be a few sort of stories within that, in the sense of, I don't know who Ian was talking about when he said that I was an expert in the steel industry. I'm not an expert in the steel industry. There are experts in this room in the steel industry. I'm basically a lobbyist for the steel industry. So what I do is I come up with always 3 arguments, not 4, not 2, 3 arguments, 3 points I want to get across. I go and see ministers and I get very angry with them and I say, you have to do this because of this. And if you don't do this, then we're going to pile more pressure on you. And then I go to the media and I tell them, and then I go on the TV and I say stuff. and then ministers get cross, call me in and say, stop speaking to the media. And I say, well, I'm sorry, Minister, that's my job. So that's what I really do. I'm a lobbyist that gets our message out there as much as we can. So let me start then, and by saying I'll start with the golden age of steelmaking. And unfortunately, I'm too young to remember the golden age of steelmaking. So the story of the modern UK steel industry begins in 1857 with a man called Henry Bessemer. Bessemer developed the Bessemer converter, a process of blowing oxygen through molten pig iron after it has been removed from the furnace, thus burning the carbon and silicon out of the pig iron, releasing heat, causing the temperature to rise, and then for producing steel. The special thing here is this new process reduced the cost of producing steel, making Sheffield the centre of the world for steel production. And what that did then is it even more accelerated the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom. And indeed, less than 20 years later, in 1875, Britain accounted for 40% of the world's steel production. We're nowhere near that now. So that's where we were, that's where we started. Fast forward 100 years, and some of you in this room will have no idea who those two people are. So to 1967, the year before I was born, 350,000 people worked in the steel industry. It was a newly nationalised British Steel Corporation, as it was then, formed by Harold Wilson. That's Harold Wilson there. His Labour government in that year. This compares, so 350,000 people compares with, and I'll come on to this, 30,000 now. So what has happened in the last 50 years to reduce the steel sector in the UK so drastically? And what does the future hold, as I said? We've got that whole historical legacy, and perhaps that actually, as I might come on to, might be part of the problem. But it appears to be going only in one direction in the last 50 years, because by the 1970s, by the 1970s, we saw a world recession crippling British steel, and the workforce reducing, remember I said 350,000 to 142,000 in 1980, and yet to 52,000 in 1988. 350,000 in 1967, 52,000 in 1988. It was then that Margaret Thatcher, you'll recognise Margaret Thatcher, I'm sure, decided enough was enough, and she privatised British Steel. And actually, that might have been a great thing, because this new model was successful at first. The company made a pre-tax profit of £733 million in 1989-1990. However, and you'll see there's a story here in terms of the cyclical nature of the global steel sector, because there was another recession in 1990, and then before you saw another downturn in the steel sector. And the rest of the 1990s was a slow and steady decline, with thousands of jobs cut every few years at various sites across the country. So it's that steady decline. In October 1990, British Steel merged with the Dutch steel company Hoogevens to create the Chorus Group. And then, I find this astounding, I had to go and check the facts and figures here, then the largest steel maker in Europe and the third largest in the world, the Chorus Group. However, the optimism didn't last long, and by June 2000, as recent as June 2000, Chorus was announcing job losses of 4,500. This later rose, even before it was completed, to 6,050 after making losses of £20 million a month. In 2007, Tata Steel bought Chorus, and its workforce then, Tata Steel, not the whole sector, stood at 23,000 people. So now I move on to the steel crisis, because the next stage of the steel industry period you'll all be familiar with, potentially, is the steel crisis of 2015-2016. And as you can see from slide 5 here, this is this really shows the steel crisis. So if you think, right, this is the sort of the summer, August or something, July of 2015, you can see prices were fairly good before that, and then suddenly, dramatically over a few months, the price of steel fell. This is just one particular type of steel, hot rolled coil, but it's a commodity, more of a commodity type of steel, so it's a good benchmark of where prices got to. So ignore this bit, just focus on this bit at the moment. So incredibly low prices. And it had before then been increasing, and somebody, a CEO of one of the very large global steel companies, told me at the time how much profit he was able to report to his board, and it was billions for that year. And he was just saying, you know, it was just fantastic. And then the next year, those billions of profits turned into billions of losses. So the downturn was unexpected, as I said. However, I'd say the word that the crisis, and us as UK Steel, as I said, lobbyists, us as UK Steel starting to use the word crisis started, and I remember the day of speaking to one of our significant members and saying, I'm thinking I might use the word crisis. What do you think? And they said, yeah, we're starting to use that internally. So the day when SSI, the steel plant in Redcar, announced it was closing, that was the day that we started putting in our press release the word crisis. We started using that word crisis. So when the closure of SSI plant in Redcar in October 2015 happened, this led to the loss of a further 2,200 job losses. And it was one at the time of the few remaining blast furnaces in the country. There are still 2 sites that have blast furnaces, but you know, in the 60s there were many of them. So it was a massive. I can't overestimate how massive that blow was, because the Redcar works had been producing steel for 98 years, and the decision just to halt production in both the coke ovens and the blast furnace meant actually there was no turning back for that site. Why? Because what it meant was the blast furnace was full of molten iron, coke and lime, and they just switched it off, and it was left to cool and it solidified. So that's it. It's not a mothballed blast furnace. It's a broken blast furnace, and it would take billions of pounds. Well, I don't know billions, but to rebuild and make new. And the government was warned about this danger, and the coke ovens as well, was warned that they really needed to mothball it. It would take a couple of months and millions of pounds, but the best bet was to mothball, and they ignored that. And we and the trade unions called it an act of vandalism at the time. And it would have put off any buyers that there might have been, which there probably weren't at the time, but it really would have meant that was it for that site. Then a few short weeks later, and I remember I was in a taxi, got a phone call, Caparo Industries has collapsed. That's then gone as well. And it just seemed like at that time, in October 2005, that it was just time after time after, sorry, not time after time, but company after company after company. Because the crisis then cranked up another notch in 2016 when Tata Steel announced it was putting up the UK steel business for sale. That they employed about 18,000 people in Port Talbot, in Llanwern, in Rotherham, in Shotton, in Corby, Redcar and Hartlepool. So what I hadn't said is I'd literally started in my role as Director General of UK Steel like 10 weeks before this. So it was a really difficult time. I was just thinking, you know, what have I come into? And so we quickly at that point needed to think, right, what do we do? We're in crisis as a sector. We need a campaign. We had to spring into action and play our small part as UK Steel of saving the UK steel industry. And actually spring into action doesn't quite do it justice in the amount of work that went into that campaign. In the space of 6 months, From September 2015, as I said, I'd done something like over 150 television and radio interviews, and we as UK Steel had been quoted in over 7,000 press articles. But crucially, and Ian has hinted at this, the point I really want to make about this campaign is it brought together everyone that's connected with the UK steel industry. So the CEOs of the steel companies, union leaders as well, steel MPs, and it brought us all together, and this consistent message, and I'll come on to this, of what this consistent message was absolutely critical. So all of us, CEOs, UK Steel, CEOs, union leaders, steel MPs, we all were saying the same thing. There was no divergence. We all owned, and the term was the 5 asks at the time. And the aim of the campaign was, of course, to save the steel industry, but also to put in place measures that would ensure the sector had a sustainable and viable future in the long term. Public support for the campaign was absolutely key to this success. There is, of course, an attachment and a sense of goodwill towards the steel sector, the steel industry, from large sections of the British public that I believe other sectors would really, really struggle to achieve. So that's a real plus there. So the 5 asks that we called on government to carry out. This was very much like us as a sector saying, we're in an emergency, government, you need to do this. And they were 5 things. One was to tackle unilaterally high energy prices, and all of these I'll come on to in more detail, for the UK steel sector, making us uncompetitive. Address uncompetitive business rates, increase the proportion of steel from the UK used in public procurement projects, tackle the relentless dumping of steel, mainly from China at the time, but other markets as well, onto the UK market. And then the last one, amend emissions permits to account for regional variations. So it's the first 4 that were really key and crucial here. In the end, the campaign achieved a personal commitment from then Prime Minister David Cameron to save the steel industry. Apparently, we understand he was on the phone almost daily to the business department saying, look, sort this out. I keep hearing about it. I keep hearing trade union leaders, CEOs, UK Steel in the media. I don't want to hear it. I want you to sort it. And that was fantastic to hear that we'd resonated and got that message across to the Prime Minister. So we pushed for and called for summits, one in Rotherham, and the Business Secretary Sajid Javid at the time and other ministers came to that, and the CEOs came, and it was very dramatic, and the trade unions came along to that, and in Brussels. And as a result of this, the then Chancellor George Osborne announced a package of measures for the energy compensation package. As I said, that was what our first ask on electricity prices, worth £50 million. That kind of helped. The government also, at the time, agreed to take a 25% stake in Port Talbot, the Tata Steel site in South Wales, which went a long way to helping the steelworks in which went a long way to helping the steelworks in South Wales, not because the government did actually take the 25%, but it provided that reassurance that if they needed it, it was there, and it gave sort of more a boost to the sector in terms of confidence. At the EU level, the European Commission started bringing in anti-dumping tariffs, so that in terms of dumping of Chinese steel and steel from Russia as well, etc., was starting to reduce. I'll come on to this in more detail later. But from, as I said, October 2015, for the next 12 to 18 months, it was an extremely busy period for us, with daily media calls at the weekend, all the time, meeting ministers every single week, and ensuring that members, trade unions and steel MPs were fully briefed on what we were lobbying on and the progress that we were making here. We were in an emergency and we needed action, not warm words at the time. Let me tell you 2 stories very quickly that encapsulate that time. So, and actually I thought Ian was going to steal my thunder here, in terms of one of the things that sticks in my mind is I was giving evidence to the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy select committee in Parliament. You know, it's very much like this. It's a horseshoe and you sit here and the MPs sit round here. And I was given evidence and I was sitting alongside CEOs, and you do an introduction. And the CEOs were saying, yes, and business is very bad, and the steel CEOs, business is very bad, and we hope it's going to be better. And they were going along doing an introduction, 1, 2, and then it was me. And I was thinking, well, this is a bit dry, isn't it? It's not getting across that it's a real problem. So I'd had my speech prepared of what I was going to say at the beginning. And I thought, no, I'm going to be just as dry as them. So quickly, I just said, they said, can you sum up what the situation is? And I said, okay, the steel industry is a patient on the operating table. The patient is bleeding to death, and unless the patient receives life-saving surgery, the patient is going to die on that operating table. And the MPs went, oh, wow. And it was fantastic, because what it did is it made them sit up and listen. And in the newspapers, when they were reporting on this select committee, that was the headline, bleeding to death on the operating table. Another story, less dramatic, was the UK, in terms of dumping of steel onto our market, and dumping isn't just a willy-nilly term, it's a technical term. If steel is being sold at under market value, state-supported, etc., subsidised, it's dumped onto the market, and it's illegal under WTO rules. And the UK, within the EU 28, never supported putting tariffs on dumped steel. It was always saying, no, we don't need that. And so never, ever voted in favour. And I went to see the minister. It was Anna Soubry at the time. She was the business minister. And I said to her, you know that you're not going to vote in favour of this dumping measure that's coming up next week at the European meeting in Brussels, don't you? And she said, of course we're not going to vote. We're going to vote in favour of it. We support it. And I said, well, your official sitting next to you has told me you're not going to vote in favour, you're going to vote against. And I said, we're in crisis and you're voting against. And she said, we're going to vote in favour. And ever since then, the UK government has either voted in favour or abstained and has never voted against. And that was after years and years of them always voting against. So, before I go any further, I want to give you an insight into the steel sector. And I've not confirmed before, but hopefully the slides could be available if people wanted them. Because there's a few slides that actually I'm not going to talk to. I just thought they're there as a kind of an aid memoir that to provide a bit of background. So the steel industry is, this is steel production in the UK, these are the companies. Let me go on to the next slide, because the next slide is, this is where steel is still made in the UK in terms of making steel, not re-rollering it or something or making it into a product. It's literally made, this is where it's made. So it's not very many places, it's 6. It looks like 5 there, but it's 6 in terms of steel companies that make steel in the UK. And here's some figures in terms of our total gross contribution to the economy. That we make now 8 million tonnes of steel, and I've got some slides later on that shows that 8 million tonnes of steel is not very much at all anymore, like we used to make. But there's a positive at the end of this. And that we employ 31,000 people or thereabouts. And this is, I'm not going to talk about this, but this gives you a sense of who the companies are and what they make and where they make it and what type of steel they make. So enough of doom and gloom. So I was then going to say that the global steel sector, including here in the UK, now finds itself in a much better position thanks largely to an increase in global steel prices, much less dumping of steel onto the UK, and a weak pound, which helps exports. So as I said, when we were here, I said, don't look that way. But look how quickly that the steel sector, kind of in terms of the price of steel, came out of that really deep recession. Now, it's true that Ian said, well, you didn't say out of the woods, you said something else, but we're not out of the woods yet. And when I talk to steel CEOs, I say, you know, it's here now, isn't it? It's so much better. And I said, is it good, or is it that this was so bad that means that it's okay? Because we were in a much more difficult situation than the rest of Europe. When I used to meet my European counterparts, they kind of put their arm around me and say, I'm really sorry, because they weren't losing as many jobs as we were, and then globally, again, so I felt we were at the bottom of the bottom at the time because of government policy, which I'll come on to a bit more now. So, one of the things that I want to get across, and this is what it'll be at the end, is I was in the World Steel Association annual conference in Tokyo last week, and I was talking to the Japanese steel sector, and I was talking to the German steel sector, and I was talking to the American steel sector, and it's so clear that successful steel sectors in countries are successful. A lot of the reason is because they have some very supportive governments and very supportive government policy in terms of support in that sector. And I'll come on to it because we don't have that in the UK. So there really is a strong correlation between government support and a strong steel sector. So let me start with a number of those areas that I talked about. So I'll talk about Chinese dumping of steel, and one of the major causes was the illegal dumping of underpriced, state-supported Chinese steel into the UK or the European market. For those of you unfamiliar with the story, let me give you a brief summary. In 2015, China's steel exports reached a record 107 million tonnes. Now, I said last year we produced 8 million tonnes. China was exporting in 2015 107 million tonnes. It was making, or it is making at the moment, something like 800 million tonnes, 100 times what we make in the UK. So having that amount of exports actually led to a global steel glut, causing unprecedented problems for other steel producers around the world. And what we also saw then was overcapacity in the steel sector, and again that's why we see the exports as they are. And indeed, so that then, I'm not blaming China, actually, in the sense of if you're producing this much steel, each province is kind of slightly independent, and each province wants to have its own steel sector and produce as much steel as it can. It was racing. I wish I'd put a slide in to show you steel production in China, but it would have been very much like this. It was just going up and up and up to satisfy the huge demand that the Chinese economy had for steel, and therefore it was just responding to that demand. But suddenly 1 or 2% in terms of cool-off for the Chinese economy meant that steel had to go somewhere, and it went abroad. So when it does, it's really difficult for us to cope. And one example in reinforcing bar, which you'd find in here, there's reinforcing bar, steel bar in there. And in 2011, China had 0% of the UK rebar market, and by 2015 it had 43% of the UK rebar market. Shows how quick things can happen. So the EU brought in anti-dumping measures, and that helped in terms of reducing the amount of, I think I've got a slide of exports. It's not million tonnes there, it's thousands of tonnes. But as you can see, it then dramatically went down. That was two things, that China was using more of its steel, but also because the EU had brought in anti-dumping measures. So electricity price disparity. Let me go on to this one, which is that, and you won't be able to see here, but this is energy price here, and we go Sweden and France, and where's Germany? Well, Germany's quite high, but UK the highest. Out of all of Europe, UK the highest in terms of electricity prices. And that's not just because, well, it's more difficult here. That's because of government policy, the reason why electricity prices are so high. The difference between France and Germany for us is £17 a megawatt hour, or about £50 million more expensive here than it would be in France or Germany for electricity. Equivalent to 20% of the total average investment in our sector. So it's not just an additional cost, it's a drain in terms of investing in R&D, etc., and makes us less attractive place to invest. We're looking at updating these figures now, because these are 2017 figures, and that figure of £17 a megawatt hour isn't going down, even though I've just said government were helping, isn't going down, it's going up. It's going to be, instead of £17 a megawatt hour, it's £25 a megawatt hour, costing the industry £70 million. And what I mean is, If the UK steel sector was based in Germany, we would be paying £70 million less for our electricity. That would make us much more competitive. So there's an urgent need for us to be even more vocal about this going forward, because it has major implications in terms of business decisions for companies, as you can imagine. Then I want to talk about a political dilemma here in terms of coming out of the steel crisis and working with government. Steel has been hampered by years of underinvestment, both from industry and government, and a lack of imagination and willingness to take bold steps to support the sector. It isn't a party political point. This is very much both Labour and Conservative in terms of not actively supporting us as a sector or manufacturing as a sector as you would in France, Germany, Italy, and now the US. So we have been engaged for the last, 18 months and a year certainly in what we saw, or we called a sector deal with government. Government said to us, hey, come to us with a sector deal proposal and we'll work with you to reach these lovely sunny uplands of what the steel sector could be. Now, this is not the 5 hours. The 5 hours have kind of gone, that's history. That was us calling on government to do something. The sector deal is us saying what we want to do as a sector. We're going to do this, this, this and this, and we want you, government, to help us by doing this, this and this. So it's kind of a self-help, it's a working together, it's a sector deal. And this is what we were calling for. And it really is just, and even if you can't see from the back there, this is really just to increase investment, increase R&D, work with our supply chain more, and therefore we would be a more robust sector. That's what we committed to the government to do. And if you see the slides afterwards, you'll see there were very big numbers. This is what we wanted government to do. And it was along the same line. So it's basically saying, again, tackle energy price disparity, help us invest better, business rates, which I'll come to, and R&D, that was really key to it, and procurement. So let me spend the remainder of this talk focusing on the current policy ASCAR, and I'll talk a little bit about Brexit, but not a lot. So I've talked about electricity prices, don't need to talk about that. Business rates. Business rates, very quickly, is that companies pay business rates, business taxes, and on the property they sit on, as you know. And what's crazy in the UK, if you buy a new piece of kit, a new piece of machinery, and it makes you more productive, it's fantastic, it's really encouraged by the government to do, you then pay more business rates. So you can think, okay, so I'm going to have to fork out to buy a new piece of plant and machinery, and then my taxes are going to go up. So it's a disincentive to become more efficient, more productive. And we said to government, look, this is just crazy. Could you not do this? Could you not put a business rate tax on new plant and machinery? And they said, oh, we totally and utterly get why you're asking for that. And oh, God, yeah, we definitely want to see that. Oh, but it costs us about 1.2 billion, so we're not going to do it. And they literally said that. They didn't say, oh, you haven't made the argument. They literally said, no, it brings in too much tax revenue. We're not going to do it. Then the other issue is public procurement. What was really interesting is when we were meeting with government ministers every week, we met with Matt Hancock, who's now Health. He's now the Secretary of State for Health, but then he was the Cabinet Minister. And we met him to talk about public procurement, using more steel from the UK in public projects. And he got all the departments around the table and he said, right, how much steel percentage-wise? And none of them knew. They all said, well, we don't know, we don't even look at that. So what we've done is we've tried to say to government, look, this is a win-win. You, the government, want the local economy to work, local economies and UK economies to work much better. Therefore, you should be encouraging your departments to do this. And they did. They produced a paper that said all government departments need to increase the amount of steel they use in their projects. But what's interesting is they don't really still measure it. They don't publish it. They're saying they will publish it at some point, but they don't do it now. Now, you'd say, well, this is ridiculous. Let's just let the market decide. But the problem is, you know, in terms of why, if you were the head of procurement for, say, the Department of Health or Siemens, why would you want to use steel from the UK? And there are a number of reasons, and there may be environmental reasons, you know, in terms of just-in-time reasons of getting a better product. But one of them that I really want to focus on here, which is a really local economy and therefore national economy issue, and I think this, if I could only talk about one slide ever, it would be this slide, and let me explain it. This is where steel employees are in the bars. Then the blue one, as it goes, so where it shows that steel jobs are in areas of probably high unemployment and more, I don't know if I can use the word deprivation, but the mean regional salaries in steel areas is low. But look, the top one, the really top one, is the mean steel salary. So if you have a job in the steel area, you have a really good job. You're highly skilled, you're highly marketable. And this shows that, you know, government support in the steel sector, not handouts, but support in the steel sector to be competitive is a really good idea for a local economy, therefore the national economy. Going forward. And I find it absolutely incredible that we aren't focusing on this even more. And actually, one example would be the UK, we carried out research that shows that the ability of UK steel producers to supply high quality steel into the automotive sector delivers an additional £120 million of gross value added to the economy compared to a situation where automotive steels are just sourced from outside the UK. So again, it shows that it adds to the economy if it's from the UK, the steel, rather than elsewhere. R&D. Innovation obviously is key to the UK steel sector. And last month we hosted a UK Steel Innovation Day at the Science Museum in London. And we brought together members and member companies and customers in the supply chain to talk about how best they can serve the UK sector. And technical innovation taking place in the steel industry and opportunities represents throughout the steel industry it's critical to unlocking the potential for a sustainable steel sector going forward. If you think of when we were in the steel crisis, there was one company in Austria who invests a huge amount, huge amount in R&D. They were the only company in Europe that weren't losing money in the steel crisis because they were at the top of their game. But it was because they have a 50-year plan. They can invest for that longer term. So in the budget this year, we have called for R&D within the R&D Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, a £1 billion fund for energy-intensive sectors, for foundation sectors, for us to invest in R&D. And we'll see next week on Monday in the budget whether we're successful in that or not. And really, it should be a no-brainer. We should be successful there. But I'm not counting my chickens because we're told by the Chancellor in meetings with the Chancellor, don't inspect anything, don't expect any spending or good news for manufacturing in the budget. So let me move on to Brexit, and I'm nearing the end, but I'm nearing the bit where I want to get to because it's the more positive bit. The elephant in the room is Brexit. I'm not going to talk a lot about Brexit because every sector is worried about Brexit, worried about a no-deal situation. And so really, when you think about it, we want frictionless trade at the border, we want regulatory alignment as much as possible, but it applies to us really as much as it applies to other sectors. So unless you hadn't heard of the problems for other sectors, which I'm sure you all have, then there's no point in me reiterating those. Although an interesting one is, everyone talks about tariffs. Well, steel itself, whatever the deal or no deal, steel is zero tariffed and there will be no tariffs applying to steel after Brexit because it was an agreement with the steel sector, between the steel sector and governments in the 80s, that we would not apply tariffs of steel traded between developed economies. We've produced, as UK Steel, extensive guidance to our members on no-deal Brexit, but also in terms of if there's a transition. And that wasn't like a lobbying document. It was literally saying, oh, on VAT you do this, and on customs you do that, and to export there you fill out this form. We sent that out to members last week or the week before. We hope it provides practical advice to members. I talked a lot before about trade remedies, and Steel does have a particular concern about trade remedies, and I've already spoken about the measures the EU has taken in an attempt to alleviate Chinese imports or other imports altering the steel market. But we also had, earlier on this year, President Trump imposing 25% tariffs on steel entering the US market. And therefore, for us, you know, we see the raft of what that is a protectionist measure, and we are not for protectionist measures. We are for free trade, and that's what the steel sector thrives on. It's our lifeblood in our sector. So we want to see as we leave the EU, all the trade remedies that are in place at EU level that we're part of, we want to see transition over to the UK, and the government is kind of saying, yeah, we're going to do that. But nothing's certain. We had a meeting with Department of International Trade today, and don't tell anyone this, but they were actually saying, oh, you know, no, we're going to have real problems with transitioning this bit and that bit, and there's going to be a gap of, you know, 2-3 months. And we said a gap of 2 or 3 months would mean that we're then open to be in the dumping capital of the world. And they're saying, well, yeah, but legally we can't. And I had to leave the meeting to come here. I don't know what the outcome was at the end, but it was a really worrying meeting, thinking, well, we're October, the end of October, and by March we could be suffering these real problems that we thought we were kind of leaving behind. So President Trump, the 25% tariffs, we were really worried about those in February when they were announced, thinking it's going to bring us right back to those dark days of the steel crisis. That kind of hasn't happened because, is it the next slide? Yeah. This is the craziest thing about President Trump's 25% tariffs. And I was saying it on the 1st of June when the tariffs came in. President Trump, and I thought, well, it's Trump. I'll try and use lots of gun analogies and shooting. So I said he's shooting himself in the foot because this isn't completely accurate, because as you'll see, this is in dollars, this is in euros. It's not, but it does show what I'm trying to say. North America in red, Europe prices in blue. And as you can see, and again, it's as I said, it's different currencies. But what I really want to show you is this bit here, that the President Trump's tariffs came in, and I said at the time, I said, this is only going to hurt his manufacturing sector. For every one job he's going to save in the steel sector in the US as a result of these tariffs, he's going to lose 4 or 5 jobs in the manufacturing sector. And he will, because the price of steel in North America is higher than anywhere else in the world at the moment. And so it's a great market to go into, actually. So, you know, while it lasts, but the manufacturers in the US are paying higher prices for their steel. So there you go, President Trump. It's short-termism for mid-term elections, but it's going to come back and bite him going forward. So let me finish here, really, when I talk about the bright future and what holds for us here. So why would we have a bright future for steel in the UK? Well, we could look at it one way where we saw a steady decline. We've got a government at the moment that aren't really that interested in us. The steel crisis in their minds is finished. Why do they really need to help us more? And, you know, are we going to be there in the future or not? And can we just buy our steel from somewhere else? Not sustainable, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to say that from my mind, that is the completely wrong way to be thinking, because whilst steel production, UK steel production has just gone down and down and down and down. and we're actually below Belgium now in terms of the amount of steel we produce. So that's a very bad situation. As you know, if I'd have gone back further, it would have been higher and higher. That's a very bad situation to be in. But, and when I've been very negative about government, but actually they paid for a report by Grant Thornton, well over £150,000 last year, that came out after we put in that sector deal proposal to government. And this Grant Thornton report found, and I quote, "There is a significant future UK demand opportunity for the UK steel industry. Based on the current levels of domestic supply achieved by the UK steel industry, this represents a £3.8 billion per annum opportunity and revenue stream in 2030, of which construction and automotive are the most important sectors. With further growth in the UK context in domestic supply chains, the opportunity is even greater. The scale of opportunity has the potential to be transformational for the industry, and there are, and this is the catch, there are a number of challenges to accessing it." So the government's own report that they paid for says there's a massive opportunity. And why is that when it goes like this? Well, it's because of this. This is demand. So I talked about production, but there's demand of steel in the UK. And that's actually much higher. So if you look before, look, 7.6 million tonnes, we export half of what we produce, but we import more, because you see imports are at 60%. But the demand in the UK is much, much higher. Now, the next slide is even better because, and you don't need to read the bits in red at all, what I want you to see is the demand at the moment, even though it's slightly different to what we said, 9.4 million tonnes in 2015, the steel demand in 2030, it's 11 million tonnes. Well, why can't the UK steel sector supply more of that 11 million tonnes? Well, this is what this report says. The report says, yes, the UK sector can supply more of that 11 million tonnes, and therefore, if it does, it will get this much in increased sales in the UK. And all we need to do is do much more of this bit. Making sure we've got the capability and the capacity to do it, that we invest in R&D, and that we work with our supply chains. But we can only do that if we have, and this is the answer of government, a competitive environment to do that. And we haven't at the moment. As I said, we've got energy prices are too high, uncompetitive business rates. We haven't even got government encouraging us to invest in R&D. But if we do, then we could have that bright future going forward. And this is where I think we sit now at the precipice of, do we have further decline and rely on imports and kind of have a much more negative impact on our economy, or do we actually turn it around and look at, I mean, this bit is only, this bit is only UK. We only looked at the UK, but we could have looked at Europe and global demand. Global demand for steel is increasing 3% year on year. Well, why should we not have more of that global demand and export more, let alone even supply our own sector? So I believe that the UK steel sector doesn't need to die in this country. It actually needs to not only survive, but thrive going forward and be a very successful sector, employing many more people and contributing to the wealth of this country. Thank you very much.